Chapter 3 All idolization makes life poor. To beautify it is to take away its character of complexity. It is to destroy it. Leave that to the moralists, my boy. History is made by men, but they do not make it in their heads. The ideas that are born in their consciousness play an insignificant part in the march of events. History is dominated and determined by the tool and the production, by the force of economic conditions. Capitalism has made socialism, and the laws made by the capitalism for the protection of property are responsible for anarchism. No one can tell what form the social organization may take in the future. Then why indulge in prophetic fantasies? At best, they can only interpret the mind of the prophet, and can have no objective value. Leave that pastime to the moralists, my boy. Michèle, the ticket-of-leave apostle, was speaking in an even voice, a voice that wheezed as if deadened and oppressed by the layer of fat on his chest. He had come out of a highly hygienic prison, round like a tub, with an enormous stomach and distended cheeks of a pale, semi-transparent complexion, as though for 15 years the servants of an outraged society had made a point of stuffing him with fattening foods in a damp and lightless cellar. And ever since he had never managed to get his weight down as much as an ounce. It was said that for 3 seasons running a very wealthy old lady had sent him for a cure to Marienbad, where he was about to share the public curiosity once with a crowned head, but the police on that occasion ordered him to leave within 12 hours. His martyrdom was continued by forbidding him all access to the healing waters, but he was resigned now. With his elbow presenting no appearance of a joint, but more like a bend in a dummy's limb thrown over the back of a chair, he leaned forward slightly over his short and enormous thighs to spit into the grate. "Yes, I had the time to think things out a little," he added without emphasis. "Society has given me plenty of time for meditation." On the other side of the fireplace, in the horsehair armchair where Mrs. Verloc's mother was generally privileged to sit, Karl Yundt giggled grimly, with the faint black grimace of a toothless mouth. The terrorist, as he called himself, was old and bald, with a narrow snow-white wisp of a goatee hanging limply from his chin. An extraordinary expression of underhand malevolence survived in his extinguished eyes. When he rose painfully, the thrusting forward of his skinny, groping hand, deformed by gouty swellings, suggested the effort of a moribund murderer, summoning all his remaining strength for a last stab. He leaned on a thick stick, which trembled under his other hand. "I have always dreamed," he mouthed fiercely, "of a band of men absolute in their resolve to discard all scruples in the choice of means, strong enough to give themselves frankly the name of destroyers, and freed from the taint of that resigned pessimism which rots the world. No pity for anything on earth, including themselves, and death enlisted for good and all in the service of humanity. That's what I would have liked to see." His little bald head quivered, imparting a comical vibration to the wisp of white goatee. His enunciation would have been almost totally unintelligible to a stranger. His worn-out passion, resembling in its impotent fierceness the excitement of a senile sensualist, was badly served by a dried throat and toothless gums which seemed to catch the tip of his tongue. Mr. Verloc, established in the corner of the sofa at the other end of the room, emitted 2 hearty grunts of assent. The old terrorist turned slowly his head on his skinny neck from side to side. "And I could never get as many as 3 such men together. So much for your rotten pessimism," he snarled at Michèle, who uncrossed his thick legs, similar to bolsters, and slid his feet abruptly under his chair in a sign of exasperation. He a pessimist? Preposterous! He cried out that the charge was outrageous. He was so far from pessimism that he saw already the end of all private property coming along logically, unavoidably, by the mere development of its inherent viciousness. The possessors of property had not only to face the awakened proletariat, but they had also to fight amongst themselves. Yes, struggle, warfare, was the condition of private ownership. It was fatal. Ah, he did not depend upon emotional excitement to keep up his belief. No declamations, no anger, no visions of blood-red flags waving, or metaphorical lurid suns of vengeance rising above the horizon of a doomed society. Not he. Cold reason, he boasted, was the basis of his optimism. Yes, optimism. His laborious wheezing stopped. Then, after a gasp or two, he added, "Don't you think that, if I had not been the optimist I am, I could not have found in 15 years some means to cut my throat? And in the last instance, There was always the walls of my cell to dash my head against. The shortness of breath took all fire, all animation out of his voice. His great pale cheeks hung like filled pouches. Seated in front of the fireplace, Conrad Ossipon, ex-medical student, the principal writer of the FP leaflets, stretched out his robust legs, keeping the soles of his boots turned up to the glow in the grate. A bush of crinkly yellow hair topped his red, freckled face, with a flattened nose and prominent mouth cast in the rough mold of the Negro type. His almond-shaped eyes leered languidly over the high cheekbones. He wore a gray flannel shirt. The loose ends of a black silk tie hung down the buttoned breast of his serge coat, and his head resting on the back of his chair, his throat largely exposed, he raised to his lips a cigarette in a long wooden tube, puffing jets of smoke straight up at the ceiling. Michèle pursued his idea, the idea of his solitary reclusion, the thought vouchsafed to his captivity and growing like a faith revealed in visions. He talked to himself, indifferent to the sympathy or hostility of his hearers, indifferent indeed to their presence, from the habit he had acquired of thinking aloud hopefully in the solitude of the four whitewashed walls of his cell, in the sepulchral silence of the great blind pile of bricks near a river, sinister and ugly like a colossal mortuary for the socially drowned. He was no good in discussion, not because any amount of argument could shake his faith, but because the mere fact of hearing another voice disconcerted him painfully, confusing his thoughts at once, these thoughts that for so many years, in a mental solitude more barren than a waterless desert, no living voice had ever combated, commented, or reproved. No one interrupted him now, and he made again the confession of his faith, mastering irresistible and complete like an act of grace, the secret of fate discovered in the material side of life, the economic condition of the world responsible for the past and shaping the future, the source of all history, of all ideas, guiding the mental development of mankind and the very impulses of their passion. A harsh laugh from Conrad Ossipon cut the tirade dead short in a sudden faltering of the tongue and the bewildered unsteadiness of the apostle's mildly exalted eyes. He closed them slowly for a moment, as if to collect his routed thoughts. A silence fell, but what with the two gas jets over the table and the glowing grate, the little parlor behind Mr. Verloc's shop had become frightfully hot. Mr. Verloc, getting off the sofa with ponderous reluctance, opened the door leading into the kitchen to get more air, then thus disclosed the innocent Stevie, seated very good and quiet at a deal table, drawing circles, circles, circles. Innumerable circles, concentric, eccentric, a coruscating whirl of circles that by their tangled multitude of repeated curves, uniformity of form, and confusion of an intersecting lines suggested a rendering of cosmic chaos, the symbolism of a mad art attempting the inconceivable. The artist never turned his head, and in all his soul's application to the task his back quivered, his thin neck sunk into a deep hollow at the base of the skull, seemed ready to snap. Mr. Verloc, after a grunt of disapproving surprise, returned to the sofa. Alexander Ossipon got up, tall in his threadbare blue serge suit under the low ceiling, shook off the stiffness of long immobility, and strolled away into the kitchen, down 2 steps, to look over Stevie's shoulder. He came back, pronouncing oracularly, "Very good, very characteristic, perfectly typical." "What's very good?" grunted inquiringly Mr. Verloc, settled again in the corner of the sofa. The other explained his meaning negligently, with a shade of condescension and a toss of his head towards the kitchen. "Typical of this form of degeneracy. These drawings, I mean." "You would call that lad a degenerate, would you?" mumbled Mr. Verloc. Comrade Alexander Ossipon, nicknamed the Doctor, ex-medical student without a degree, afterwards wandering lecturer to working men's associations upon the socialistic aspect of hygiene, author of a popular quasi-medical study in the form of a cheap pamphlet seized promptly by the police, entitled The Corroding Vices of the Middle Classes, special delegate of the more or less mysterious Red Committee, together with Carl Jung and Michèle for the work of literary propaganda, turned upon the obscure familiar of at least 2 embassies that glance of insufferable, hopelessly dense sufficiency which nothing but the frequentation of science can give to the dullness of common mortals. That's what he may be called scientifically. Very good type, too, altogether, of that sort of degenerate. It's enough to glance at the lobes of his ears. If you read Lombroso... Mr. Verloc, moody and spread largely on the sofa, continued to look down the row of his waistcoat buttons, but his cheeks became tinged by a faint blush. Of late, even the merest derivative of the word science, a term in itself inoffensive and of indefinite meaning, had the curious power of evoking a definitely offensive mental vision of Mr. Vladimir, in his body as he lived, with an almost supernatural clearness. And this phenomenon, deserving justly to be classed amongst the marvels of science, induced in Mr. Verloc an emotional state of dread and exasperation tending to express itself in violent swearing. But he said nothing. It was Karl Yundt who was heard, implacable to his last breath. "Lombroso is an ass!" Conrad Ossipon met the shock of this blasphemy by an awful vacant stare, and the other, his extinguished eyes without gleams blackening the deep shadows under the great bony forehead, mumbled, catching the tip of his tongue between his lips at every second word, as though he were chewing it angrily. "Did you ever see such an idiot? For him, the criminal is the prisoner. Simple, is it not? What about those who shut him up there? Forced him in there? Exactly, forced him in there. And what is crime? Does he know that, this imbecile who has made his way in this world of gorged fools by looking at the ears and teeth of a lot of poor luckless devils? Teeth and ears mark the criminal, do they? And what about the law that marks him still better, the pretty branding instrument invented by the overfed to protect themselves against the hungry? Red-hot applications on their vile skins, eh? Can't you smell and hear from here the thick hide of the people burn and sizzle? That's how criminals are made for your Lombrosos to write their silly stuff about." The knob of his stick and his legs shook together with passion, whilst the trunk, draped in the wings of the havelock, preserved his historic attitude of defiance. He seemed to sniff the tainted air of social cruelty, to strain his ear for its atrocious sounds. There was an extraordinary force of suggestion in this posturing. The all but moribund veteran of dynamite wars had been a great actor in his time, actor on platforms, in secret assemblies, in private interviews. The famous terrorist had never in his life raised personally as much as his little finger against the social edifice. He was no man of action. He was not even an orator of torrential eloquence sweeping the masses along in the rushing noise and foam of a great enthusiasm. With a more subtle intention, he took the part of an insolent and venomous evoker of sinister impulses which lurk in the blind envy and exasperated vanity of ignorance, in the suffering and misery of poverty, in all the hopeful and noble illusions of righteous anger, pity, and revolt. The shadow of his evil gift clung to him, yet like the smell of a deadly drug in an old vial of poison, emptied now, useless, ready to be thrown away upon the rubbish heap of things that had served their time. Michèle, the ticket of leave apostle, smiled vaguely with his glued lips. His pasty moon face drooped under the weight of melancholy assent. He had been a prisoner himself. His own skin had sizzled under the red-hot brand, he murmured softly. But Conrad Ossipon, nicknamed the Doctor, had got over the shock by that time. "You don't understand," he began disdainfully, but stopped short, intimidated by the dead blackness of the cavernous eyes and the face turned slowly towards him with a blind stare, as if guided only by the sound. He gave the discussion up with a slight shrug of the shoulders. Stevie, accustomed to move about disregarded, had got up from the kitchen table, carrying off his drawing to bed with him. He had reached the parlor door in time to receive in full the shock of Karl Yundt's eloquent imagery. The sheet of paper covered with circles dropped out of his fingers, and he remained staring at the old terrorist, as if rooted suddenly to the spot by his morbid horror and dread of physical pain. Stevie knew very well that hot iron applied to one's skin hurt very much. His scared eyes blazed with indignation. It would hurt terribly. His mouth dropped open. Michèle, by staring unwinkingly at the fire, had regained that sentiment of isolation necessary for the continuity of his thought. His optimism had begun to flow from his lips. He saw capitalism doomed in its cradle, born with the poison and the principle of competition in its system, the great capitalists devouring the little capitalists, concentrating the power and the tools of production in great masses, perfecting industrial processes, and in the madness of self-aggrandizement only preparing, organizing, enriching, making ready the lawful inheritance of the suffering proletariat. Michèle pronounced the great word, patience, and his clear blue glance, raised to the low ceiling of Mr. Verloc's parlor, had a character of seraphic trustfulness. In the doorway, Stevie, calmed, seemed sunk in hebetude. Conrad Ossipon's face twitched with exasperation. Then it's no use doing anything, no use whatever. I don't say that, protested Michèle gently. His vision of truth had grown so intense that the sound of his strange voice failed to rout it this time. He continued to look down at the red coals. Preparation for the future was necessary, and he was willing to admit that the great change would perhaps come in the upheaval of a revolution. But he argued that revolutionary propaganda was a delicate work of high conscience. It was the education of the masters of the world. It should be as careful as the education given to kings. He would have it advance its tenets cautiously, even timidly, in our ignorance of the effect that may be produced by any given economic change upon the happiness, the morals, the intellect, the history of mankind. For history is made with tools, not with ideas, and everything is changed by economic conditions, art, philosophy, love, virtue, truth itself. The coals in the grate settled down with a slight crash, and Michèle, the hermit of visions in the desert of a penitentiary, got up impetuously. Round like a distended balloon, he opened his short, thick arms as if in a pathetically hopeless attempt to embrace and hug to his breast a self-regenerated universe. He gasped with ardor. The future is as certain as the past. Slavery, feudalism, individualism, collectivism. This is the statement of a law, not an empty prophecy. The disdainful pout of Conrad Ossipon's thick lips accentuated the Negro type of his face. Nonsense, he said calmly enough. There is no law and no certainty. The teaching propaganda be hanged. What the people knows does not matter, were its knowledge ever so accurate. The only thing that matters to us is the emotional state of the masses. Without emotion there is no action. He paused, then added with a modest firmness. I am speaking to you scientifically. Scientifically. Eh? What did you say, Verloc? Nothing, growled from the sofa Mr. Verloc, who, provoked by the abhorrent sound, had merely muttered a damn. The venomous spluttering of the old terrorist without teeth was heard. Do you know how I would call the nature of the present economic conditions? I would call it cannibalistic. That's what it is. They are nourishing their greed on the quivering flesh and the warm blood of the people. Nothing else. Stevie swallowed the terrifying statement with an audible gulp, and at once, as though it had been swift poison, sank limply in a sitting posture on the steps of the kitchen door. Michèle gave no sign of having heard anything. His lips seemed glued together for good. Not a quiver passed over his heavy cheeks. With troubled eyes he looked for his round, hard hat, and put it on his round head. His round and obese body seemed to float low between the chairs under the sharp elbow of Carl Yunt. The old terrorist, raising an uncertain and claw-like hand, gave a swaggering tilt to a black felt sombrero shading the hollows and ridges of his wasted face. He got in motion slowly, striking the floor with his stick at every step. It was rather an affair to get him out of the house because, now and then, he would stop, as if to think, and did not offer to move again until impelled forward by Michèle. The gentle apostle grasped his arm with brotherly care, and behind him, his hands in his pockets, the robust Ossipon yawned vaguely. A blue cap with a patent leather peak set well at the back of his yellow bush of hair gave him the aspect of a Norwegian sailor bored with the world after a thundering spree. Mr. Verloc saw his guests off the premises, attending them bareheaded, his heavy overcoat hanging open, his eyes on the ground. He closed the door behind their backs with restrained violence, turned the key, shot the bolt. He was not satisfied with his friends. In the light of Mr. Vladimir's philosophy of bomb-throwing they appeared hopelessly futile. The part of Mr. Verloc in revolutionary politics having been to observe, he could not all at once, either in his own home or in larger assemblies, take the initiative of action. He had to be cautious. Moved by the just indignation of a man well over 40, menaced in what is dearest to him, his repose and his security, he asked himself scornfully what else could have been expected from such a lot. This Carl Yunt, this Michèle, this Ossipon. Pausing in his intention to turn off the gas burning in the middle of the shop, Mr. Verloc descended into the abyss of moral reflections. With the insight of a kindred temperament, he pronounced his verdict. A lazy lot, this Carl Yunt, nursed by a blear-eyed old woman, a woman he had years ago enticed away from a friend and afterwards had tried more than once to shake off into the gutter. Jolly lucky for Yunt that she had persisted in coming up time after time, or else there would have been no one now to help him out of the bus by the Green Park railings, where that spectre took its constitutional crawl every fine morning. When that indomitable, snarling old witch died, the swaggering spectre would have to vanish too, there would be an end to Fury Call Yunt. And Mr. Verloc's morality was offended also by the optimism of Michèle, annexed by his wealthy old lady who had taken lately to sending him to a cottage she had in the country. The ex-prisoner could moon about the shady lanes for days together in a delicious and humanitarian idleness. As to Ossipon, that beggar was sure to want for nothing as long as there were silly girls with savings bank books in the world. And Mr. Verloc, temperamentally identical with his associates, drew fine distinctions in his mind on the strength of insignificant differences. He drew them with a certain complacency, because the instinct of conventional respectability was strong within him, being only overcome by his dislike of all kinds of recognized labor, a temperamental defect which he shared with a large proportion of the revolutionary reformers of a given social state. For obviously one does not revolt against the advantages and opportunities of that state, but against the price which must be paid for the same in the coin of accepted morality, self-restraint, and toil. The majority of revolutionaries are the enemies of discipline and fatigue mostly. There are natures, too, to whose sense of justice the price exacted looms up monstrously enormous, odious, oppressive, worrying, humiliating, extortionate, intolerable. Those are the fanatics. The remaining portion of social rebels is accounted for by vanity, the mother of all noble and vile illusions, the companion of poets, reformers, charlatans, prophets, and incendiaries. Lost for a whole minute in the abyss of meditation, Mr. Verloc did not reach the depth of these abstract considerations. Perhaps he was not able. In any case, he had not the time. He was pulled up painfully by the sudden recollection of Mr. Vladimir, another of his associates, whom in virtue of subtle moral affinities he was capable of judging correctly. He considered him as dangerous. A shade of envy crept into his thoughts. Loafing was all very well for these fellows who knew not Mr. Vladimir and had women to fall back upon, whereas he had a woman to provide for. At this point, by a simple association of ideas, Mr. Verloc was brought face to face with the necessity of going to bed some time or other that evening. Then why not go now, at once? He sighed. The necessity was not so normally pleasurable as it ought to have been for a man of his age and temperament. He dreaded the demon of sleeplessness, which he felt had marked him for his own. He raised his arm and turned off the flaring gas jet above his head. A bright band of light fell through the parlor door into the part of the shop behind the counter. It enabled Mr. Verloc to ascertain at a glance the number of silver coins in the till. These were but a few, and for the first time since he opened the shop he took a commercial survey of its value. The survey was unfavorable. He had gone into trade for no commercial reasons. He had been guided in the selection of this peculiar line of business by an instinctive leaning towards shady transactions where money is picked up easily. Moreover, it did not take him out of his own sphere, the sphere which is watched by the police. On the contrary, it gave him a publicly confessed standing in that sphere, and as Mr. Verloc had unconfessed relations which made him familiar with, yet careless of the police, there was a distinct advantage in such a situation. But as a means of livelihood, it was by itself insufficient. He took the cash box out of the drawer, and turning to leave the shop, became aware that Stevie was still downstairs. What on earth is he doing there? Mr. Verloc asked himself. What's the meaning of these antics? He looked dubiously at his brother-in-law, but he did not ask him for information. Mr. Verloc's intercourse with Stevie was limited to the casual mutter of a morning, after breakfast, "My boots," and even that was more a communication at large of a need than a direct order or request. Mr. Verloc perceived with some surprise that he did not know really what to say to Stevie. He stood still in the middle of the parlor and looked into the kitchen in silence. Nor yet did he know what would happen if he did say anything, and this appeared very queer to Mr. Verloc in view of the fact, borne upon him suddenly, that he had to provide for this fellow too. He had never given a moment's thought till then to that aspect of Stevie's existence. Positively, he did not know how to speak to the lad. He watched him gesticulating and murmuring in the kitchen. Stevie prowled round the table like an excited animal in a cage. A tentative, "Hadn't you better go to bed now?" produced no effect whatever, and Mr. Verloc, abandoning the stony contemplation of his brother-in-law's behavior, crossed the parlor wearily, cash-box in hand. The cause of the general lassitude he felt while climbing the stairs being purely mental, he became alarmed by its inexplicable character. He hoped he was not sickening for anything. He stopped on the dark landing to examine his sensations, but a slight and continuous sound of snoring pervading the obscurity interfered with their clearness. This sound came from his mother-in-law's room. Another one to provide for, he thought, and on this thought walked into the bedroom. Mrs. Verloc had fallen asleep with the lamp, no gas was laid upstairs, turned up full on the table by the side of the bed. The light thrown down by the shade fell dazzlingly on the white pillow sunk by the weight of her head, reposing with closed eyes and dark hair done up in several plaits for the night. She woke with the sound of her name in her ears, and saw her husband standing over her. "Winnie! Winnie!" At first she did not stir, lying very quiet and looking at the cash-box in Mr. Verloc's hand. But when she understood that her brother was capering all over the place downstairs, she swung out in one sudden movement on to the edge of the bed. Her bare feet, as if poked through the bottom of an unadorned sleeved calico sack, buttoned tightly at neck and wrists, felt over the rug for the slippers while she looked upward into her husband's face. "I don't know how to manage him," Mr. Verloc explained peevishly. "Won't do to leave him downstairs alone with the lights." She said nothing, glided across the room swiftly, and the door closed upon her white form. Mr. Verloc deposited the cash-box on the night table, and began the operation of undressing by flinging his overcoat onto a distant chair. His coat and waistcoat followed. He walked about the room in his stockinged feet, and his burly figure, with the hands worrying nervously at his throat, passed and repassed across the long strip of looking-glass in the door of his wife's wardrobe. Then, after slipping his braces off his shoulders, he pulled up violently the Venetian blind and leaned his forehead against the cold window-pane. A fragile film of glass stretched between him and the enormity of cold, black, wet, muddy, inhospitable accumulation of bricks, slates, and stones, things in themselves unlovely and unfriendly to man. Mr. Verloc felt the latent unfriendliness of all out of doors with a force approaching to positive bodily anguish. There is no occupation that fails a man more completely than that of a secret agent of police. It's like your horse suddenly falling dead under you in the midst of an uninhabited and thirsty plain. The comparison occurred to Mr. Verloc because he had sat astride various army horses in his time, and had now the sensation of an incipient fall. The prospect was as black as the window-pane against which he was leaning his forehead. And suddenly the face of Mr. Vladimir, clean-shaved and witty, appeared enhaloed in the glow of its rosy complexion like a sort of pink seal impressed in the fatal darkness. This luminous and mutilated vision was so ghastly physically that Mr. Verloc started away from the window, letting down the Venetian blinds with a great rattle. Discomposed and speechless with the apprehension of more such visions, he beheld his wife re-enter the room and get into bed in a calm, businesslike manner which made him feel hopelessly lonely in the world. Mrs. Verloc expressed her surprise at seeing him up yet. "I don't feel very well," he muttered, passing his hands over his moist brow. "Giddiness?" "Yes, not at all well." Mrs. Verloc, with all the placidity of an experienced wife, expressed a confident opinion as to the cause, and suggested the usual remedies, but her husband, rooted in the middle of the room, shook his lowered head sadly. "You'll catch cold standing there," she observed. Mr. Verloc made an effort, finished undressing, and got into bed. Down below in the quiet, narrow street, measured footsteps approached the house, then died away unhurried and firm, as if the passer-by had started to pace out all eternity from gas-lamp to gas-lamp in a night without end. And the drowsy ticking of the old clock on the landing became distinctly audible in the bedroom. Mrs. Verloc, on her back and staring at the ceiling, made a remark. "Taking's very small today." Mr. Verloc, in the same position, cleared his throat as if for an important statement, but merely inquired, "Did you turn off the gas downstairs?" "Yes, I did," answered Mrs. Verloc conscientiously. "That poor boy is in a very excited state tonight," she murmured, after a pause which lasted for 3 ticks of the clock. Mr. Verloc cared nothing for Stevie's excitement, but he felt horribly wakeful, and dreaded facing the darkness and silence that would follow the extinguishing of the lamp. This dread led him to make the remark that Stevie had disregarded his suggestion to go to bed. Mrs. Verloc, falling into the trap, started to demonstrate at length to her husband that this was not impudence of any sort, but simply excitement. There was no young man of his age in London more willing and docile than Stephen, she affirmed, none more affectionate and ready to please, and even useful, as long as people did not upset his poor head. Mrs. Verloc, turning towards her recumbent husband, raised herself on her elbow and hung over him in her anxiety that he should believe Stevie to be a useful member of the family. That ardor of protecting compassion, exalted morbidly in her childhood by the misery of another child, tinged her sallow cheeks with a faint dusky blush, made her big eyes gleam under the dark lids. Mrs. Verloc then looked younger. She looked as young as Winnie used to look, and much more animated than the Winnie of the Belgravian mansion days had ever allowed herself to appear to gentlemen lodgers. Mr. Verloc's anxieties had prevented him from attaching any sense to what his wife was saying. It was as if her voice was talking on the other side of a very thick wall. It was her aspect that recalled him to himself. He appreciated this woman, and the sentiment of this appreciation, stirred by display of something resembling emotion, only added another pang to his mental anguish. When her voice ceased, he moved uneasily and said, "I haven't been feeling well for the last few days." He might have meant this as an opening to a complete confidence, but Mrs. Verloc laid her head on the pillow again, and staring upward, went on, "That boy hears too much of what is talked about here. If I had known they were coming tonight, I would have seen to it that he went to bed at the same time I did. He was out of his mind with something he overheard about eating people's flesh and drinking blood. What's the good of talking like that?" There was a note of indignant scorn in her voice. Mr. Verloc was fully responsive now. "Ask Karl Yundt," he growled savagely. Mrs. Verloc, with great decision, pronounced Karl Yundt a disgusting old man. She declared openly her affection for Michèle, of the robust Ossipon, in whose presence she always felt uneasy behind an attitude of stony reserve. She said nothing whatever. And continuing to talk of that brother, who had been for so many years an object of great care and fears, "He isn't fit to hear what's said here. He believes it's all true. He knows no better. He gets into his passions over it." Mr. Verloc made no comment. "He glared at me, as if he didn't know who I was when I went downstairs. His heart was going like a hammer. He can't help being excitable. I woke Mother up and asked her to sit with him till he went to sleep. It isn't his fault. He's no trouble when he's left alone." Mr. Verloc made no comment. "I wish he had never been to school," Mrs. Verloc began again brusquely. "He always taking away those newspapers from the window to read. He gets a red face poring over them. We don't get rid of a dozen numbers in a month. They only take up room in the front window. And Mr. Ossipon brings every week a pile of those F.P. tracts to sell at a halfpenny each. I wouldn't give a halfpenny for the whole lot. It's silly reading, that's what it is. There's no sale for it. The other day Stevie got hold of one, and there was a story in it of a German soldier officer tearing half off the ear of a recruit, and nothing was done to him for it. The brute! I couldn't do anything with Stevie that afternoon. The story was enough, too, to make one's blood boil. But what's the use of printing things like that? We aren't German slaves here, thank God. It's not our business, is it?" Mr. Verloc made no reply. "I had to take the carving knife from the boy," Mrs. Verloc continued, a little sleepily now. "He was shouting and stamping and sobbing. He can't stand the notion of any cruelty. He would have struck that officer like a pig if he had seen him then. It's true, too. Some people don't deserve much mercy." Mrs. Verloc's voice ceased, and the expression of her motionless eyes became more and more contemplative and veiled during the long pause. "Comfortable, dear?" she asked in a faint, far-away voice. "Shall I put out the light now?" The dreary conviction that there was no sleep for him held Mr. Verloc mute and hopelessly inert in his fear of darkness. He made a great effort. "Yes, put it out," he said, at last, in a hollow tone. End of Chapter 3.
Chapter 4. Most of the 30 or so little tables, covered by red cloths with a white design, stood ranged at right angles to the deep brown wainscoting of the underground hall. Bronze chandeliers with many globes depended from the low, slightly vaulted ceiling, and the fresco paintings ran flat and dull all around the walls without windows, representing scenes of the chase and of outdoor revelry in medieval costumes. Varlets in green jerkins brandished hunting knives and raised on high tankards of foaming beer. "Unless I am very much mistaken, you are the man who would know the inside of this confounded affair," said the robust Ossipon, leaning over, his elbows far out on the table and his feet tucked back completely under his chair, his eyes with wild green eagerness. An upright, semi-ground piano near the door, flanked by 2 palms in pots, executed suddenly, all by itself, a waltz tune with aggressive virtuosity. The din it raised was deafening. When it ceased, as abruptly as it had started, The bespectacled, dingy little man who faced Ossipon behind a heavy glass mug full of beer emitted calmly what had the sound of a general proposition. In principle, what one of us may or may not know as to any given fact can't be a matter for inquiry to the others. Certainly not, Comrade Ossipon agreed in a quiet undertone. In principle. With his big, florid face held between his hands, he continued to stare hard, while the dingy little man in spectacles coolly took a drink of beer and stood the glass mug back on the table. His flat, large ears departed widely from the sides of his skull, which looked frail enough for Ossipon to crush between thumb and forefinger. The dome of the forehead seemed to rest on the rim of the spectacles. The flat cheeks of a greasy, unhealthy complexion were merely smudged by the miserable poverty of a thin, dark whisker. The lamentable inferiority of the whole physique was made ludicrous by the supremely self-confident bearing of the individual. His speech was curt, and he had a particularly impressive manner of keeping silent. Ossipon spoke again from between his hands in a mutter. "Have you been out much today?" "No, I stayed in bed all the morning," answered the other. "Why?" "Oh, nothing," said Ossipon, gazing earnestly, and quivering inwardly with the desire to find out something, but obviously intimidated by the little man's overwhelming air of unconcern. When talking with this comrade, which happened but rarely, the big Ossipon suffered from a sense of moral and even physical insignificance. However, he ventured another question. "Did you walk down here?" "No, omnibus," the little man answered readily enough. He lived far away in Islington, in a small house down a shabby street, littered with straw and dirty paper, where out of school hours a troop of assorted children ran and squabbled with a shrill, joyless, rowdy clamour. His single back room, remarkable for having an extremely large cupboard, he rented furnished from two elderly spinsters, dressmakers in a humble way, with a clientele of servant girls mostly. He had a heavy padlock put on the cupboard, but otherwise he was a model lodger, giving no trouble and requiring practically no attendance. His oddities were that he insisted on being present when his room was being swept, and that when he went out he locked his door and took the key away with him. Ossipon had a vision of these round, black-rimmed spectacles progressing along the street on top of an omnibus, their self-confident glitter falling here and there on the walls of houses or lowered upon the heads of the unconscious stream of people on the pavements. The ghost of a sickly smile altered the set of Ossipon's thick lips as he thought of the walls nodding, of people running for life at the sight of those spectacles. If they had only known. What panic! He murmured interrogatively, "Been sitting long here?" "An hour or more," answered the other negligently, and took a pull at the dark beer. All his movements, the way he grasped the mug, the act of drinking, the way he set the heavy glass down and folded his arms, had a firmness, an assured precision, which made the big and muscular Ossipon, leaning forward with staring eyes and protruding lips, look the picture of eager indecision. "An hour?" he said. "Then it may be you haven't heard yet the news I've heard just now in the street, have you?" The little man shook his head negatively the least bit. But as he gave no indication of curiosity, Ossipon ventured to add that he had heard it just outside the place. A newspaper boy had yelled the thing under his very nose, and not being prepared for anything of the sort, he was very much startled and upset. He had to come in there with a dry mouth. "I never thought of finding you here," he added, murmuring steadily, with his elbows planted on the table. "I come here sometimes," said the other, preserving his provoking coolness of demeanor. It's wonderful that you, of all people, should have heard nothing of it, the big Ossipon continued. His eyelids snapped nervously upon the shining eyes. You, of all people, he repeated tentatively. This obvious restraint argued an incredible and inexplicable timidity of the big fellow before the calm little man, who again lifted the glass mug, drank, and put it down with brusque and assured movements. And that was all. Ossipon, after waiting for something, word or sign, that did not come, made an effort to assume a sort of indifference. "Do you," he said, deadening his voice still more, "give your stuff to anybody who's asking for it?" "My absolute rule is never to refuse anyone, as long as I have a pinch by me," answered the little man with decision. "That's a principle?" commented Ossipon. "It's a principle." "And you think it's sound?" The large round spectacles, which gave a look of staring self-confidence to the sallow face, confronted Ossipon like sleepless, unwinking orbs flashing a cold fire. "Perfectly. Always. Under every circumstance. What could stop me? Why should I not? Why should I think twice about it?" Ossipon gasped, as it were, discreetly. "Do you mean to say you would hand it over to a tech if one came to ask you for your wares?" The other smiled faintly. "Let them come and try it on, and you will see," he said. "They know me, but I know also every one of them. They won't come near me, not they." His thin, livid lips snapped together firmly. Ossipon began to argue. "But they could send someone, rig a plant on you, don't you see? Get the stuff from you in that way, and then arrest you with the proof in their hands." "Proof of what? Dealing in explosives without a license, perhaps." This was meant for a contemptuous jeer, though the expression of the thin, sickly face remained unchanged, and the utterance was negligent. "I don't think there's one of them anxious to make that arrest. I don't think they could get one of them to apply for a warrant. I mean one of the best. Not one." "Why?" Ossipon asked. "Because they know very well I take care never to part with the last handful of my wares. I've it always by me." He touched the breast of his coat lightly. "In a thick glass flask," he added. "So I've been told," said Ossipon with a shade of wonder in his voice. "But I didn't know if they know," interrupted the little man crisply, leaning against the straight chair back which rose higher than his fragile head. "I shall never be arrested. The game isn't good enough for any policeman of them all. To deal with a man like me requires sheer, naked, inglorious heroism." Again his lips closed with a self-confident snap. Ossipon repressed a movement of impatience. "Or recklessness, or simply ignorance," he retorted. "They've only got to get somebody for the job who does not know you carry enough stuff in your pocket to blow yourself and everything within 60 yards of you to pieces." "I never affirmed I could not be eliminated," rejoined the other. "But that wouldn't be an arrest. Moreover, it's not as easy as it looks." "Bah!" Ossipon contradicted. "Don't be too sure of that. What's to prevent a half-dozen of them jumping upon you from behind in the street? With your arms pinned to your sides, you could do nothing, could you?" "Yes, I could. I'm seldom out in the streets after dark," said the little man impassively. "And never very late. I walk always with my right hand closed around the India rubber ball which I have in my trouser pocket. The pressing of this ball actuates a detonator inside the flask I carry in my pocket. It's the principle of the pneumatic instantaneous shutter for a camera lens. The tube leads it up." With a swift disclosing gesture he gave Ossipon a glimpse of an India rubber tube, resembling a slender brown worm, issuing from the armhole of his waistcoat and plunging into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. His clothes, of a nondescript brown mixture, were threadbare and marked with stains, dusty in the folds, with rugged buttonholes. "The detonator is partly mechanical, partly chemical," he explained with casual condescension. It is instantaneous, of course, murmured Ossipon with a slight shudder. Far from it, confessed the other with a reluctance which seemed to twist his mouth dolorously. A full 20 seconds must elapse from the moment I press the ball till the explosion takes place. Whew! Whistled Ossipon, completely appalled. 20 seconds? Horrors! You mean to say you could face that? I should go crazy. It wouldn't matter if you did. Of course, it's the weak point of this special system, which is only for my own use. The worst is that the manner of exploding is always the weak point with us. I'm trying to invent a detonator that would adjust itself to all conditions of action, and even to unexpected changes of conditions. A variable and yet perfectly precise mechanism. A really intelligent detonator. 20 seconds, muttered Ossipon again. Oh, and then? With a slight turn of the head, the glitter of the spectacles seemed to gauge the size of the beer saloon in the basement of the renowned Silenus restaurant. Nobody in this room could hope to escape, was the verdict of that survey. Nor yet this couple going up the stairs now. The piano at the foot of the staircase clanged through a mazurka with brazen impetuosity, as though a vulgar and impudent ghost were showing off. The keys sank and rose mysteriously. Then all became still. For a moment, Ossipon imagined the overlighted place changed into a dreadful black hole, belching horrible fumes, choked with ghastly rubbish of smashed brickwork and mutilated corpses. He had such a distinct perception of ruin and death that he shuddered again. The other observed with an air of calm sufficiency. In the last instance, it is character alone that makes for one's safety. There are very few people in the world whose character is as well established as mine. I wonder how you managed it, growled Ossipon. Force of personality, said the other without raising his voice. And coming from the mouth of that obviously miserable organism, the assertion caused the robust Ossipon to bite his lower lip. Force of personality, he repeated with ostentatious calm. I have the means to make myself deadly, but that by itself, you understand, is absolutely nothing in the way of protection. What is effective is the belief those people have in my will to use the means. That's their impression. It is absolute. Therefore, I am deadly. There are individuals of character amongst that lot, too, muttered Ossipon ominously. Possibly, but it is a matter of degree, obviously, since, for instance, I am not impressed by them. Therefore they are inferior. They cannot be otherwise. Their character is built upon conventional morality. It leans on the social order. Mine stands free from everything artificial. They are bound in all sorts of conventions. They depend on life, which in this connection is a historical fact surrounded by all sorts of restraints and considerations, a complex, organized fact open to attack at every point. Whereas I depend on death, which knows no restraint and cannot be attacked. My superiority is evident. This is a transcendental way of putting it, said Ossipon, watching the cold glitter of the round spectacles. I've heard Carl Jung say much the same thing not very long ago. Carl Jung, mumbled the other contemptuously. The delegate of the International Red Committee has been a posturing shadow all his life. There are 3 of you delegates, aren't there? I won't define the other 2, as you are one of them. But what you say means nothing. You are the worthy delegates for revolutionary propaganda, but the trouble is not only that you are as unable to think independently as any respectable grocer or journalist of them all, but that you have no character whatsoever. Ossipon could not restrain a start of indignation. But what do you want from us? He exclaimed in a deadened voice. What is it you are after yourself? A perfect detonator was the peremptory answer. What are you making that face for? You see, you can't even bear the mention of something conclusive. I'm not making a face, growled the annoyed Ossipon bearishly. You revolutionaries, the other continued with leisurely self-confidence, are the slaves of social convention, which is afraid of you. Slaves of it as much as the very police that stand up in the defense of that convention. Clearly you are, since you want to revolutionize it. It governs your thoughts, of course, and your action too, and thus neither your thoughts nor your action can ever be conclusive. He paused, tranquil with that air of close, endless silence, then almost immediately went on. You are not a bit better than the forces arrayed against you, than the police, for instance. The other day I came suddenly upon Chief Inspector Heath at the corner of Tottenham Court Road. He looked at me very steadily, but I did not look at him. Why should I give him more than a glance? He was thinking of many things, of his superiors, of his reputation, of the law courts, of his salary, of the newspapers, of 100 things, but I was thinking of my perfect detonator only. He meant nothing to me. He was as significant as... I can't call to mind anything insignificant enough to compare him with, except Carl Jung, perhaps. Like to like. The terrorist and the policeman both come from the same basket. Revolution, legality, countermoves in the same game, forms of idleness at the bottom. Identical. He plays his little game, so do you propagandists, but I don't play. I work 14 hours a day and go hungry sometimes. My experiments cost money now and again. And then I must do without food for a day or two. You were looking at my beer. Yes, I've had 2 glasses already, and shall have another presently. This is a little holiday, and I celebrate it alone. Why not? I've the grit to work alone, quite alone, absolutely alone. I've worked alone for years. Ossipon's face had turned a dusky red. At the perfect detonator, eh? He sneered very low. Yes, retorted the other. It is a good definition. You couldn't find anything half so precise to define the nature of your activity, with all your committees and delegations. It is I who am the true propagandist. We won't discuss that point, said Ossipon, with an air of rising above personal considerations. I am afraid I'll have to spoil your holiday for you, though. There's a man blown up in Greenwich Park this morning. How do you know? They've been yelling the news in the streets since 2 o'clock. I bought the paper and just ran in here. Then I saw you sitting at this table. I've got it in my pocket now. He pulled the newspaper out. It was a good-sized, rosy sheet, as if flushed by the warmth of its own convictions, which were optimistic. He scanned the pages rapidly. Ah, here it is. Bomb in Greenwich Park. There isn't much so far. 11:30, foggy morning, effects of explosion felt as far as Romney Road and Park Place. Enormous hole in the ground under a tree filled with smashed roots and broken branches. All round fragments of a man's body blown to pieces. That's all. The rest's mere newspaper gup. No doubt a wicked attempt to blow up the observatory, they say. That's hardly credible. He looked at the paper for a while longer in silence, then passed it to the other, who, after gazing abstractly at the print, laid it down without comment. It was Ossipon who spoke first, still resentful. The fragments of only one man, you note. Ergo, he blew himself up. That spoils your day off for you, don't it? Were you expecting that sort of move? I hadn't the slightest idea, not the ghost of a notion of anything of the sort being planned. To come off here, in this country. Under the present circumstance, it's nothing short of criminal. The little man lifted his thin black eyebrows with dispassionate scorn. Criminal? What is that? What is crime? What can be the meaning of such an assertion? How am I to express myself? One must use the current words, said Ossipon impatiently. The meaning of this assertion is that this business may affect our position very adversely in this country. Isn't that crime enough for you? I am convinced you have been giving away some of your stuff lately. Ossipon stared hard. The other, without flinching, lowered and raised his head slowly. You have, burst out the editor of the FP leaflets in an intense whisper. No. And are you really handing it over at large like this, for the asking, to the first fool who comes along? Just so. The condemned social order has not been built up on paper and ink, and I don't fancy that a combination of paper and ink will ever put an end to it, whatever you may think. Yes, I would give the stuff with both hands to every man, woman, or fool that likes to come along. I know what you are thinking about, but I am not taking my cue from the Red Committee. I would see you all hounded out of here, or arrested, or beheaded for that matter, without turning a hair. What happens to us as individuals is not of the least consequence. He spoke carelessly, without heat, almost without feeling, and Ossipon, secretly much affected, tried to copy this detachment. If the police here knew their business, they would shoot you full of holes with revolvers, or else try to sandbag you from behind in broad daylight. The little man seemed already to have considered that point of view in his dispassionate, self-confident manner. Yes, he assented with the utmost readiness. But for that they would have to face their own institutions. Do you see? That requires grit. Uncommon grit. Grit of a special kind. Ossipon blinked. I fancy that's exactly what would happen to you if you were to set up your laboratory in the States. They don't stand on ceremony with their institutions there. I am not likely to go and see. Otherwise your remark is just, admitted the other. They have more character over there, and their character is essentially anarchistic. Fertile ground for us, the States, very good ground. The great Republic has the root of the destructive matter in her. The collective temperament is lawless, excellent. They must shoot us down, but... You are too transcendental for me, growled Ossipon with moody concern. Logical, protested the other. There are several kinds of logic. This is the enlightened kind. America is all right. It is this country that is dangerous, with her idealistic conception of legality. The social spirit of this people is wrapped up in scrupulous prejudices, and that is fatal to our work. You talk of England being our only refuge. So much the worse. Capois. What do we want with refuges? Here you talk, print, plot, and do nothing. I dare say it's very convenient for such Carl Junts. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, then added with the same leisurely assurance, to break up the superstition and worship of legality should be our aim. Nothing would please me more than to see Inspector Heat and his likes take to shooting us down in broad daylight with the approval of the public. Half our battle would be won then. The disintegration of the old morality would have set in its very temple. That is what you ought to aim at. But you revolutionaries will never understand that. You plan the future, you lose yourselves in reveries of economical systems derived from what is, whereas what's wanted is a clean sweep and a clear start for a new conception of life. That sort of future will take care of itself if you will only make room for it. Therefore I would shovel my stuff in heaps at the corners of the street if I had enough for that. And as I haven't, I do my best by perfecting a really dependable detonator. Ossipon, who had been mentally swimming in deep waters, seized upon the last words as if it were a saving plank. Yes, your detonators. I shouldn't wonder if it was one of your detonators that made a clean sweep of the man in the park. A shade of vexation darkened the determined sallow face confronting Ossipon. My difficulty consists precisely in experimenting practically with the various kinds. They must be tried, after all. Besides, Ossipon interrupted. Who could that fellow be? I assure you that we in London had no knowledge. Couldn't you describe the person you gave the stuff to? The other turned his spectacles upon Ossipon like a pair of searchlights. Describe him, he repeated slowly. I don't think there can be the slightest objection now. I will describe him to you in one word. Verloc. Ossipon, whom curiosity had lifted a few inches off his seat, dropped back, as if hit in the face. Verloc? Impossible! The self-possessed little man nodded slightly once. Yes, he's the person. You can't say that in this case I was giving my stuff to the first fool that came along. He was a prominent member of the group, as far as I understand. Yes, said Ossipon. Prominent? No, not exactly. He was the center for general intelligence and usually received comrades coming over here. More useful than important. Man of no ideas. Years ago he used to speak at meetings, in France, I believe. Not very well, though. He was trusted by such men as Latour, Moser, and that old lot. The only talent he showed really was his ability to elude the attentions of the police somehow. Here, for instance, he did not seem to be looked after very closely. He was regularly married, you know. I suppose it's with her money that he started that shop. Seemed to make it pay, too. Ossipon paused abruptly, muttered to himself, I wonder what that woman will do now, and fell into thought. The other waited with ostentatious indifference. His parentage was obscure, and he was generally known only by the nickname of the Professor. His title to that designation consisted in his having been once assistant demonstrator in chemistry at some technical institute. He quarrelled with the authorities upon a question of unfair treatment. Afterwards he obtained a post in the laboratory of a manufactory of dyes. There, too, he had been treated with revolting injustice. His struggles, his privations, his hard work to raise himself in the social scale had filled him with such an exalted conviction of his merits that it was extremely difficult for the world to treat him with justice, the standard of that notion depending so much upon the patience of the individual. The Professor had genius, but lacked the great social virtue of resignation. Intellectually a nonentity, Ossipon pronounced aloud, abandoning suddenly the inward contemplation of Mrs. Verloc's bereaved person and business. Quite an ordinary personality. You were wrong in not keeping more in touch with the comrades, Professor, he added in a reproving tone. Did he say anything to you? Give you some idea of his intentions? I hadn't seen him for a month. It seems impossible that he should be gone. He told me it was going to be a demonstration against a building, said the Professor. I had known that much to prepare the missile. I pointed out to him that I had hardly a sufficient quantity for a completely destructive result, but he pressed me very earnestly to do my best. As he wanted something that could be carried openly in the hand, I proposed to make use of an old 1-gallon copal varnish can I happened to have by me. He was pleased at the idea. It gave me some trouble because I had to cut out the bottom first and solder it on again afterwards. When prepared for use, the can enclosed a wide-mouthed, well-coked jar of thick glass packed round with some wet clay containing 16 ounces of X2 green powder. The detonator was connected with the screw-top of the can. It was ingenious, a combination of time and shock. I explained the system to him. It was a thin tube of tin enclosing. Ossipon's attention wandered. What do you think has happened? He interrupted. Can't tell. Screwed the top on tight, which would make the connection, and then forgot the time. It was set for 20 minutes. On the other hand, the time contact being made, a sharp shock would bring about the explosion at once. He either ran the time too close or simply let the thing fall. The contact was made all right. That's clear to me at any rate. The system worked perfectly. And yet you would think that a common fool in a hurry would be much more likely to forget to make the contact altogether. I was worrying myself about that sort of failure mostly. But there are more kinds of fools than one can guard against. You can't expect a detonator to be absolutely foolproof. He beckoned a waiter. Ossipon sat rigid, with the abstracted gaze of mental travail. After the man had gone away with the money, he roused himself with an air of profound dissatisfaction. "It's extremely unpleasant for me," he mused. "Carl has been in bed with bronchitis for a week. There's an even chance that he will never get up again. Michèle is luxuriating in the country somewhere. A fashionable publisher has offered him £500 for a book. It will be a ghastly failure. He has lost the habit of consecutive thinking in prison, you know." The professor, on his feet, now buttoning his coat, looked about him with perfect indifference. "What are you going to do?" asked Ossipon warily. He dreaded the blame of the Central Red Committee, a body which had no permanent place of abode, and whose membership he was not exactly informed. If this affair eventuated in the stoppage of the modest subsidy allotted for the publication of the FP pamphlets, then indeed he would have to regret Verloc's inexplicable folly. "Solidarity with the extremist form of action is one thing, and silly recklessness is another," he said, with a sort of moody brutality. "I don't know what came to Verloc. There's some mystery here. However, he's gone. You may take it as you like, but under the circumstances the only policy for the militant revolutionary group is to disclaim all connection with this damned freak of yours. How to make the disclaimer convincing enough is what bothers me." The little man on his feet, buttoned up and ready to go, was no taller than the seated Ossipon. He levelled his spectacles at the latter's face point blank. "You might ask the police for a testimonial of good conduct. They know where every one of you slept last night. Perhaps if you asked them, they would consent to publish some sort of official statement." "No doubt they're aware well enough that we had nothing to do with this," mumbled Ossipon bitterly. "What they will say is another thing." He remained thoughtful, disregarding the short, owlish, shabby figure standing by his side. "I must lay hands on Michèle at once and get it to speak from his heart at one of our gatherings. The public has a sort of sentimental regard for that fellow. His name is known, and I am in touch with a few reporters on the big dailies. What he would say would be utter bosh, but he has a turn of talk that makes it go down all the same." "Like treacle," interjected the professor, rather low, keeping an impassive expression. The perplexed Ossipon went on communing with himself half audibly, after the manner of a man reflecting in perfect solitude. "Confounded ass to leave such an imbecile business on my hands, and I don't even know if—" He sat with compressed lips. The idea of going for news straight to the shop lacked charm. His notion was that Verloc's shop might have been turned already into a police trap. They will be bound to make some arrests, he thought, with something resembling virtuous indignation, for the even tenor of his revolutionary life was menaced by no fault of his. And yet, unless he went there, he ran the risk of remaining in ignorance of what perhaps it would be very material for him to know. Then he reflected that if the man in the park had been so very much blown to pieces as the evening papers said, he could not have been identified. And if so, the police could have no special reason for watching Verloc's shop more closely than any other place known to be frequented by marked anarchists. No more reason, in fact, than for watching the doors of the Silenus. There would be a lot of watching all round, no matter where he went, still. "I wonder what I had better do now," he muttered, taking counsel with himself. A rasping voice at his elbow said with sedate scorn, "Fasten yourself upon the woman for all she is worth." After uttering these words, the professor walked away from the table. Ossipon, whom that piece of insight had taken unawares, gave one ineffectual start, and remained still, with a helpless gaze, as though nailed fast to the seat of his chair. The lonely piano, without as much as a music stool to help it, struck a few chords courageously, and beginning a selection of national airs, played him out at last to the tune of Blue Bells of Scotland. The painfully detached notes grew faint behind his back, while he went slowly upstairs, across the hall, and into the street. In front of the great doorway a dismal row of newspaper sellers standing clear of the pavement dealt out their wares from the gutter. It was a raw, gloomy day of the early spring, and the grimy sky, the mud of the streets, the rags of the dirty men, harmonized excellently with the eruption of the damp, rubbishy sheets of paper soiled with printer's ink. The posters, maculated with filth, garnished like tapestry the sweep of the curbstone. The trade in afternoon papers was brisk, yet in comparison with the swift, constant march of foot traffic, the effect was of indifference, of a disregarded distribution. Ossipon looked hurriedly both ways before stepping out into the cross-currents, but the professor was already out of sight. End of chapter 4.